Probably from watching the Hallmark show last night.
Oh,
So you know what, everybody, we're now live on YouTube, just so you heads up.
oh,
What is this?
we're now live streaming on YouTube.
So anything you say now will be viewed
Held
by the
against you?
public. Just so you know.
Thanks for the warning.
Well, let me throw this out. I see Ramona's on, and last week she and I were commenting on the class, and we said we felt we could say to Steve not to worry about political comments, that we would all be more than open to any politics with this group. So is that
Yeah.
in line? Ramona, say yes.
Politics is unavoidable.
Yeah. It has become very difficult to avoid.
Yeah.
Well, you can't possibly avoid it. This is what he's talking about is public health that is highly political. Yes, don't try to avoid the politics. It's there.
Right. Yep.
Yeah, and America's international response to that with World Health Organization, et cetera, is all political too. So
Yeah.
it's central to global health.
Yeah, the guy with the truck, I've never seen it.
Oh, I've seen him.
Luckily, I've never seen him. Oh, I guess it's a Jeep.
He's around.
There's Steve.
There's Steve.
There he
Good morning,
is.
Steve.
Morning.
Morning.
There he is.
Steve, this is your last time, and we're so grateful to you. 4 times when you only expected 1. This is really nice.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you,
Enjoyed
Steve.
it. I think I might come to y'all's class next month and sit in on Greg's for weeks.
Greg's good.
Yeah. Yeah, we should have switched months. I think for me, this month was been,
Double header, triple header.
Yeah.
a bit intense.
But Greg is chair of the Mecklenburg County Democrat
Precinct.
206. 206. So he's been kind of busy.
Steve's
This
co-chair.
Oh, you're co-chair? I
More or
didn't
less.
know.
No, I'm not coaching. I'm on the executive committee of that precinct. So I see Greg a lot. Yeah.
And Steve's been doing all the organizing of who does what from everything I can tell. So
Greg?
he's just been at the hub of getting the vote out.
We have a voter protection team in town. Rosemary and I are co-leads of it. So that's the work we've been doing in a
Mhm.
concentrated way in this last month is voter protection work. It's got various sorts of things involved in that: phone banking, poll observing, hotlining, canvassing, a lot of different things that have been going on up until we see what happens on Tuesday.
Or Wednesday or Thursday or.
Yeah, sure.
No, it's not or, it's and.
Yeah.
I think North Carolina and the local stuff will probably be pretty well known by Wednesday evening.
What about Tuesday evening?
Maybe.
Depends on how many absentee ballots they have and how long it takes to run those things.
What goes wrong? But
Steve, do they expect to have run all the North Carolina ballots that are in by the time they report our numbers?
Yeah, if what would be outstanding would be late arriving absentee ballots and provisionals. So I voted absentee way early in September or something. I don't know, way early.
Yeah.
That vote, along with all the rest of folks who did like me, that'll be reported the same as if I voted on election day.
They've been processed already. Every Tuesday?
Yeah, I mean, it's tabulated. It's like, imagine it being put into a machine. They're just not spitting out the counts.
Mhm.
Well, they're not sharing
They're
the
not-
counts.
They're
Somebody
hiding
would
it.
know what's going on.
They're hiding it
Not
on
us.
thumb drive. Yeah.
A lot of people have been bringing them into early voting too. We take them there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it's starting time
see.
officially, and Steve, I hope that you've had plenty of comments and thoughts and suggestions submitted so that you don't have to totally wing it today, or well, you're going to totally wing it anyways. But thank you again for these weeks of global health equity and concerns about it, and maybe even some ideas of what the hell we might do. So Steve, your turn.
Okay, thank you, Van. Yeah, this is welcome to Potpourri Sunday. This is a sort of a review of things and questions that folks have posed me. And then on the basis of one of the questions that I got from Charlie, I have a special guest today to spend the last half of the class with, who you'll see is a face maybe familiar to a few people, but unfamiliar to most. Maritza Stutz is my special guest for a conversation she and I are going to have at for the latter half of the class. Charlie had asked how to bring this health equity discussion into a local context. And Maritza works at Ada Jenkins Center as a coordinated services specialist, and she and I are going to have a conversation around these issues and with a local lens towards the end of class. But here at the beginning, I wanted to cover some questions that people had posed. Van, you'd asked and sent me an email asking, is there a dearth of primary care physicians, and is that an equity issue, and how can it be addressed? And I went and looked up in the Bureau of Health Professions, the National Center for Workforce Analysis. And while all of us are holding on by our fingernails, still believing what the government tells us, I will share with you what those statistics are. They projected that there'd be a shortage of somewhere around 20,000 primary care physicians in 2020. This is from a baseline of 205,000 in 2010, and they thought there'd be a growth to 222,000 in 2020, but the need was growing higher, aging populations, growing populations, and so the growth in the number of primary care physicians was outpaced by the growth in the need. So as we sit here now, the Health Statistics Bureau says we're about 20,000 primary care physicians short, but they say that if the nurse practitioners and physician assistants are optimally deployed, then that shortage falls to about 6,000. What's misleading about it is the disparities in distribution, that the primary care physicians aren't necessarily distributed where the need is, because the distribution is not a centralized process. When I worked in Tanzania, the government assigned physicians to districts and so on, and that's a process that's certainly foreign to us and not anywhere near what's going to happen to us. And so Van's question about whether it's an equity issue and what we can do about it, it's an interesting question to think about it from an equity perspective, because I think you have to then think from a community perspective and compare community to community, because this is not individual to individual kinds of considerations. Is it fair that small rural communities don't have as many primary care doctors as urban communities have? And I would say, that's a disparity, and there's an inequity in that. but it's at a community level, not so much individual to individual, if that makes sense. Then how can it be addressed business? The way that it's been addressed up to this point are through different mechanisms. Van shared that he was familiar with a medical school where he grew up that was formed in a public-private partnership geared towards training primary care physicians. And there are schools, particularly state-sponsored schools. I went to one, UNC, that prided itself in preparing healthcare professionals for service in North Carolina with a bit of a primary care bias in that medical school. The issue with medical training is that you don't really come out of medical school and go into practice. You have your residency programs, and that really ultimately determines how many specialists we have and how many primary care physicians we have. And based on where those residencies happen, physicians, when they choose to live, often choose to live near where they were trained. And so it's not only a distribution of the physicians, it's a distribution of where they're trained that makes a difference in where they end up living. And in Tanzania, for example, they had the same problem, that even though the government assigned physicians into the rural environments, they wouldn't go and work there. They wouldn't show up. We tried to come up with a program that trained them during their training phases in some of these rural settings, so they could get some comfort and some confidence in their ability to do what they've been trained to do in those settings. But in order to know whether that made a difference or not, we'd have to look 10 years down the road and to see if some of those same physicians who trained there ended up living there. Part of the issues around some of the solutions that have been there are like public health service scholarships, where if you get your medical school trained, you're assigned a certain number of years. Often Native American communities get their healthcare providers through mechanisms like that. The problem with these kinds of approaches is that people tend to go serve out their conscription, as it were, for a couple of years and then move on. And so these communities get new, fresh faces every few years, and no one with long-term commitment to the community. And and that's an additional inequity through that mechanism to try to address the distribution problem. And it's complicated because I see you, Evelyn. Yes.
Actually, the med school he's talking about is not where he was born, but where he taught.
It doesn't matter.
Oh, okay.
At Mercer in Macon, Georgia.
Doesn't matter.
And they will not take people who live in Atlanta, who are from Atlanta. They're not taking many out-of-state folks. They're only taking the students who are coming from basically small towns and rural areas, with the understanding that they are supposed to go back to those areas. And that's making a difference as to where the students come from.
Yeah.
There's a network of international healthcare training institutions, the Health Equity Training Network, that takes the same approach, that takes students from rural Philippines or from villages in Canada and trains them in a medical school, assuming that if folks grow up in a rural environment, they're more inclined to go back and live there. In our country, because of the freedom that we have to choose, this equity issue all comes down to larger issues around the inequities between small rural communities and larger cities and towns that we experience, that affects the quality of life in general. So if you're a healthcare provider and you have a family and you want your children to be educated, you're going to go to a community with strong education and higher quality of life. And if you have the freedom to choose that, you're going to choose it on the basis not only of how you can practice healthcare delivery, but on the quality of life that your family experiences. And until we address on a larger level the inequities that are ongoing in our communities between small rural places and large urban centers, we're going to probably face this problem in an ongoing way. I think it's one of the root causes for why we're we talked about the election on Tuesday, and it's one of the issues that's affecting why people are deciding to vote as they do. I think because of the inequity and the well-being between small rural communities and urban and suburban environments. At least that's my amateur takeaway connection between Tuesday and healthcare equity. Another question that I got was at the end of last session had to do with that, and I think this was John Kirkendall's question, and you can correct me if I got it wrong, John, but it was like, once in a hospital setting, is there a disparity in the quality of treatment received between different segments of the population once they get there? And I think this came a bit from the COVID treatment that our president received in his setting versus the COVID treatment that maybe a large segment of our population now suffering from that receive when they go in hospital. And that may be a recent example of how there may be a disparity of treatment. And I think there are disparities of treatment. Some of them have been documented in a pediatrics journal article. They studied the use of pain medicines across ethnic divisions of children when they had a fracture in their long bone of their leg. And they discovered that African American children received less opioids and less optimum treatment. And this was the treatment of little kids with broken bones. And so, there are disparities in the kind of care that people receive along ethnic lines. At least this article would indicate that that's the case. And there are other disparities too, because there is a general understanding of what the standard of care is, but certain hospitals are able to operate at higher standards of care than others. And a lot of times that's resource-based into what community they live in. So if you are one of these folks who have to travel 2 hours to get to a hospital, the first hospital you get to may not have ventilators and other things that it needs because it's operating in a low resource environment. It's one of the reasons that Medicaid needed to be expanded in all the states in order to address some of this inequity that's there, and in order to get hospitals up and running and sustainably in some of the lower resource pockets within our country. So I don't think it's always a disparity related to maybe an underlying systemic say racial injustice, but it's often just a function of how healthcare is paid for in our country, and it's fragmented in way that results in these disparities. Those are a couple of questions that I got that part of Potpourri Sunday, and it's going on 10. And I was going to leave some question time at the end for Maritza from you guys after we've had a conversation, so that I wasn't the only one who got to ask her some questions about her work and her experiences. But on the basis of what Charlie asked me to do last time, which was to place health equity into a local context, I was fortunate enough to be distance introduced to Maritza by Barbara Randolph, who I work with in a lot of community organizations. And I told Barbara what my dilemma was around Charlie's question, and she suggested that I speak with Maritza and ask her to come to the class today. So I'd like to ask Maritza to introduce herself personally, and then describe a bit about what her roles and responsibility is at the Ada Jenkins Center. Maritza.
Hi, good morning. So I am Maritza. I have been working at the Ada Jenkins Center for 8 years on staff. Prior to that, I did my internship there. Absolutely loved what Ada Jenkins stood for and their mission and vision. So I stayed on as a volunteer and was eventually hired. I'm fully bilingual. So I feel like it's an honor that I'm bilingual, even because I get to work with all demographics. So I was exclusively the case manager for the Latino community when I first started. Now we have others that are bilingual, but anyway, so that's my history with Ada Jenkins Center, and I've been able to connect a lot of people with healthcare and services and different things.
Thank you. Could a lot of us on a day-to-day basis don't necessarily interact with our neighbors that are from Latinx communities, and we have pockets of it from what of different folks from different parts of the world in our community. And I have a somewhat of a vague understanding of what our Latinx community is in North Mecklenburg. And just based on your work and your understanding, could you kind of describe for us what North Mecklenburg looks like in terms of the Latinx community here where we live?
Yes, absolutely. There are definitely pockets of the Latino community. As you can probably already know, part of that divide is the railroad crossing. So if you live on one side, it's the more affluent and very generous population. And then on the other side of the tracks tends to be, you have pockets of poverty, believe it or not, even in our area. At the Ada Jenkins Center, for example, as well, our LearnWorks program, we have at least 70% children that are referred from our local schools for extra help at the center, and over 70% are Latino children. So there is a high population of Latino community where we are. So I would say, yeah, that's about right.
And when I worked at the medical clinic, I would see folks from Venezuela. I understand there's folks from Peru. I think sometimes we think of this monolithically, like you know, the Latinx community is all immigrated from the same place. Central America often, I think, rises up, but they're in North Mecklenburg, at least from my little tiny bit of experience, we have people from all over the world that are living here.
Absolutely. If you were to look at my wall at my office, I actually have, they are such a generous community and they're so grateful. So on my wall, I actually have pictures from Guatemala, I have pictures from Venezuela, from Ecuador, from all over the region. And if you think about it also, each region has had different opportunities of education, for example. So they also have different maybe knowledge to access to healthcare, for example. So there are three different types, I'd like to call categories of immigrants that we have. So we have those that are from Venezuela or other communities, such as where there's been a coup d'etat or whatnot, or there's issue with their government, and they're highly educated and they've come to our community somehow, little Davidson, North Carolina, they're here. And so their understanding and advocacy skills to be able to gain the services are different than, for example, maybe somebody that came from a more indigenous type country, which we do have indigenous community within our community. And so they don't understand maybe necessarily and are very humble and don't have that, you know, that understanding of how to get that service. So they're different. So we have the ones that are maybe highly educated, and I will say my experience has been, for example, at this moment from Venezuela, I have engineers, I have people that worked in the government, I have attorneys, all kinds of highly skilled people. Then I have the ones that are in between that maybe have gained access, and I've helped them gain that access through DACA. Maybe they're DACA recipients, and I've been able to help them do that. And then we have the ones that don't have, they're in the shadows for the most part. They don't have and don't have that knowledge to be able to access healthcare, and they're afraid.
Last week, we talked about some recently released data from the Centers for Disease Control around excess deaths that had happened in our country from January to October. And then they divided up these deaths into ethnic groups to figure out where the largest burden of excess death was in our country. On the whole, there were, by the first 10 months or 9 months, there were 300,000 extra deaths, 2/3 of which were attributable to COVID and 1/3 of which were just excess that may be indirectly related to COVID and the burden on the health system. But nevertheless, the country as a whole had 300,000 extra deaths. But when they divided it up by ethnic community, they shared that the Latinx community had 53% excess deaths in their communities, and white folks, for example, had 11 to 11.9%. So almost four times greater excess death within the Latinx community. And I wanted to ask you whether that sort of, we talk about sniff tests or whether something rings true on that. Does that surprise you? If it doesn't surprise you, why doesn't it surprise you? What can you bring some of your experience to bear on understanding that fact for us?
Absolutely. It actually does not surprise me, unfortunately. I'm saddened to say that working with the Latinx community, there's a few different tiers. I'd like to say different tiers, right? Just like I mentioned before. But there is, first of all, the need to work. So they maybe don't have an alternative, right? I'm grateful where I work. We've been able to help families that have had COVID or maybe go through COVID, but there is that fear of, not being able to work. There is a fear of how am I going to pay for it? Is there a cost associated with it? There is a fear of, is it going to be public charge? I don't know if you all are familiar with the public charge rule. For example, with our Venezuelan community that have their legal standing is, we'll say it's in order. They can drive, they can have a social security number. So they've been granted these things while their asylum is pending. So, but if they accept any government help, it's considered public charge. So then it may deem them ineligible when their asylum hearing comes at some point. So that's one. And I've had whole families of Venezuelans that I've had to help through their COVID experience or health, So that's one. I would say right now, even this morning, I was texting with one of my clients because she's been sick for a while. I distance met with her last week, and she looks very sick. And I've been trying to get her to get to a test site, and it has been nearly impossible. She doesn't understand how to register online. I sent her where to go, and she got there, and for XYZ was turned away. I was this morning finding another place really quickly and urged her. I said, you know what? If there's a cost associated, just tell me what that is. Go get tested. Now she is in a family of 6. So that means that all of her family members are being exposed. She continues to work. So other people are being exposed. So there are various reasons of why I see the disparities. You also think about it. There's migrant workers. There are essential workers. They're working the fields. You have factory workers. The majority are made up of, immigrants as well. I see it here locally. I have another client who is a cancer survivor, one of the strongest people that I know. And she survived COVID, still has repercussions from it. But she was telling me that where she was working at the factory, they have no voice. She was coming in sick. She was having fever. She was being next to her coworkers, and it spreads. And so there's many reasons of why probably the stats show that the Latino X population, the deaths are where they are. And I see why on a daily basis.
Crowded living conditions, is that a factor? Or?
Absolutely. This family that I was helping this morning, this sweet lady I was helping this morning, she lives in a 2-bedroom house and they're a family of 6. Actually, I can go back and remember where I was privileged to go in their home way before COVID. And just such a beautiful, humble home. And beautiful on the outside. The facade is absolutely gorgeous. It doesn't look like it's such a small house. And when you walk into the bedrooms of the girls. That's their bed. That's the living room area. So this is right here in our beautiful Davidson. Yeah. So it's a big factor.
I wanted to leave some time with Maritza here, because I don't think we'll have this opportunity too often to be able to ask her questions directly. So I'd like to pause here for folks to jump in with their own questions for Maritza.
Maritza, how much of your population is transient and how much of it is stable?
I would say that is a great question. First of all, I would say that the majority of the Latino population that we have is actually pretty stable. I would say, again, it depends on the tiers, right? So I would say that those that are undocumented and don't have that opportunity to be able to fix that situation, those have been with us for a while. They are the people that are working in the kitchens, in the background, maybe the landlords, maybe, assisting, they clean houses, they're doing all those jobs, the factory work, they're doing all those jobs that we don't see. I call them, they stay in the shadows for the most part, but they've been with us for quite a while. Mm-hmm.
Are there a lot of people that need help but don't know about Ada Jenkins? Is there a problem of getting the word out?
Mm-hmm. I think that within our immediate community, the majority of people know. I think that maybe when you get to maybe pockets of Cornelius and maybe Huntersville, when you're talking about the entirety of North Mac, not everybody may be fully aware. And we do partner, I'd like to say, we do partner with other agencies within our area as well. So Neighborhood Care Center and others as well that help the communities. But I think, I don't know, probably the further out you get, more south, or then it's probably a little, maybe not as known.
Okay, thank you.
Missy.
Beyond the service that you all provide, do you know of any advocate group, church, or any particular organization that speaks up on behalf of these people, not necessarily the Latinx community, but outside that, who is their advocate?
Mm-hmm. I would say that Barbara is a great advocate as well, and we partner a lot together. I'm pretty strong, and I'm pretty strong advocate for our Latino community as well. I make no bones about accompanying them, whether it's for access to healthcare, even however long it takes. I just helped one of my clients gain ABA services for her autistic son. That took a while, but I did not give up. We go to the schools and help. And more importantly for me is to teach my clients and or friends how to advocate for themselves, give them those tools so that they can do it, because they have rights just like we do.
Does the Black community of Davidson do they need advocates, or are they're doing pretty well for themselves?
I think that within the Black community, at least my experience has been, and even with my coworkers, and now we have a new executive director, I think that they have strong advocates, even within our local community. They do. They have very strong advocates. Mhm.
Pam?
I'm encouraged to know that the Black community has strong advocates, but the participation of the Black community at Ada Jenkins seems to be low. I mean, can you talk about that?
Yes, actually, I think that that's something that is changing. It is more, for example, with the Black community or the Latino community, I think in order to get the community involved, there needs to be more of a push, even from example, one of us, right? So if, for example, if if I'm going to have an event, which I've done, for example, with Chief of Police Penny Dunn, right? So literally knock on doors, invite the community out. I think that that human touch and care works better than, for example, a flyer, or an email blast or a text blast. If they see that you genuinely care, they're going to come out. That's been my experience with all demographics.
I am on the board of the Ada Jenkins Center, and in fact, I chair a committee that is looking specifically at the Ada Jenkins Center's work for the Black community in West Davidson and elsewhere in North Mac. And we have a meeting scheduled with an African American coalition of West Davidson with the new executive director, who is African American. And so it's an issue that the center is very much aware of and working on.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you.
Is it not true that, say, a referral for LearnWorks comes from the schools, from kids that are underperforming, and it may very well be a function of some degree of success as well as just numbers in terms of older populations, African Americans, not as many African American children in West Davidson, better academic performance, and so the underperformers tend to skew to the English as a second language families, et cetera. My sense is that some of this is related to things along the lines of where your referrals come from and why they come. Is that not true?
I would say so. I think that that's something that we are also working actively. I know that Harold Rice, our executive director, he is working actively to kind of level that playing some more. And I know that he has been reaching out to our local schools to be able to not to drop one and gain another, but how do we serve the community and make it more of an even keel kind of thing. So I know that he is actively working on that. Mm-hmm.
Does Ada Jenkins have any sort of formal or informal relationship with the Davidson Police or the Sheriff's Office and so forth, so that the law enforcement officers are aware of the services that are available at Ada Jenkins?
Absolutely. We've even had the honor and privilege of having some of our police officers, for example, pre-COVID, of course, when we had our clinic running, they would come in and help translate. If they were bilingual, we've hosted activities for the community. I will have to say that Davidson is just a jewel of a place where I feel like the community trusts the police and the police trust the community. For the most part, I would say for the most part, absolutely.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Well, let's see, it's 10:20. There were a few, since Maritza, coming up to the end of 4 classes, I was going to take a few minutes at the end to try to tie
Mhm.
everything together. I really appreciate you spending your Sunday morning with us and helping me answer Charlie's question around what are some of the equity issues that people in our community are facing in regards to their health, and bringing some understanding around what's really happening out there with our friends and neighbors. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you.
And Maritza talked about, I guess, in terms of some things I've been thinking about after doing these 4 weeks, or some of the things, and Maritza talked about a level playing field, and we hear that all the time. And, when it comes to getting back to what equity is all about, and is it fair that, I think in America, we're unique in that if we imagine the whole atmosphere of living, we sort of fly in a certain stratosphere of our flight around what is fair. We ask questions like, did that person get what they earned? Were their individual liberties sort of protected, and that kind of thing? We have a certain set of questions that we think are the right questions to ask when it comes to fairness. But I think we're limiting ourselves a lot to transactional relationships in terms of what's fair. And I think that we need to fly both above and below that layer. We need to ask, not did this person get what they were supposed to by the rules, but we need to ask questions like, are the rules themselves fair? A lot of times we just stop at, were the rules followed? And it's just not enough. And I think that's part of the issue around our legislature and our courts, because a lot of the rules come from there, and the inequalities in income that are there are a function of the rules being carried out. And it's not simply just all about whether somebody's actually, on the basis of some meritocracy, earned that massive difference in their income. It doesn't have to be that way with a different set of rules. So I'm not really confident that we have fair rules in our country right now, much less level playing fields. It's like playing football and making rules that one side doesn't get to wear helmets. I mean, we have rules that are in place that are sort of not fair for certain populations that we have. They're rules. When I was in Tanzania, people talked about bags full of money being brought to the legislators to bribe them, and what a example of corruption that was in this African country, where how many billions are being spent on this election, and how much not all of it's probably by the rules, but a lot of it is. To me, that's just bags full of money that are following some set of rules that aren't really fair. So I think that meritocracy and individual liberty and following the rules is a very narrow part of our atmosphere to be flying in when we're trying to understand equity, and we all need to go deeper in thinking about what's fair and higher in terms of the way that we think about this stuff. And its impact is real in our communities, and we can see it when certain members of our community have die at a higher rate than others. And that's not only unfair, it's not right. So I'm hoping that we continue to work hard and think about this and make improvements in the way that our country is evolving in terms of dealing with being more fair to everyone who lives here. So that's my summation after 4 weeks. And I thank everybody for sticking with me and coming every Sunday. It's been an honor. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Steve.
appreciated.
Yep. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Steve. It was great.
Excellent.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.
Okay,
We
take
should
care.
all clap.
Thank you, everybody. I'll see you next month. I'm coming to Greg's class.
Good.
And thank you, Maurice.
Yeah, Maritza, thank you.
Richard, I
Thank you.
Thank you.
think she's gone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.